Okay, quick audio check for Calgary over here, making sure you guys can hear me at this volume and that everything is calibrated and feeling good. Hopefully Calgary can hear me okay. We're just waiting a little bit for things to quiet down with the other classroom and then we'll start. In the meantime, I think that's a bit better in terms of being able to see. It's quite dark though. Okay, we shall start. How's everybody doing? Yeah, everybody's here, so that's a good sign. And hopefully the same is true with Calgary. This week's been very different, right? It's been focused on front end, a lot of which has been writing things like HTML and CSS, right? And I'm guessing you've already felt that the process of writing HTML and CSS is quite different. Like even just how you think about constructing your code. Why do you think that is? Why do you think it's so different? Why does it feel so different? Because they're totally not the same, says Jared here. Yeah, it's very different, but how is it different? You know, what is, of course, there's the, we're dealing with the presentation layer of HTML and CSS for some of this week. And so that part is very different because you're not writing like behind the scenes server code. But there's actually something different about the languages too. Like HTML and CSS are quite different than JavaScript or even jQuery. It's not a language, but like the process of writing HTML and CSS is very different because the languages are different. How are the languages different?
There's no functions in HTML.
Hold on one second. Guys in the back, students in the back, lectures going on. Thanks. Yeah, so, sorry, say that again, Andy?
There's no functions in HTML.
There's no functions in HTML. Yeah, there's no like, there's no functions. There's no like, let me give you instructions, dear browser. It's not like that. It's actually more like, I would like it to look like this, please. Cross fingers, right? You've seen that meme with like Peter with the blinds, with the CSS label, the meme. You're trying to make it look like the way you want, and it's not like you're telling it draw pixel red pixels from this line to this line. You're not looping through a bunch of pixels to tell it how to actually look. Right? So you lose a lot of control and power, but you don't have to end up doing a lot of that low-level work. So instead of writing instructions, you're actually writing end result. Did you notice that? It's a very big difference. And so what I call this, or a lot of people call this, is the difference between writing imperative code and writing declarative code. In this case, with HTML and CSS, we've been writing declarative code. Declarative code meaning that I declare that the page ought to look like this, right? That the presentation of it should look like this. And so when it doesn't, it's not like we can just find the loop where we're not hitting that one line or something and not drawing that pixel that we want, right? We actually have to like think about, oh, we're not declaring things correctly here. So the debugging process is quite different. And so the mental model, how we approach it and how we learn it even, is quite different. So hopefully you've started to feel that, not just because it's in the browser and because it's front end and because it's maybe it's not my, maybe it's not your skill set to worry about those kind of things or having done those kind of things in the past, or maybe it is. But even putting those things aside, just the way you write the language is quite different, which is interesting, right? Jared?
Would you say that like programming or JavaScript is like more objective than front end? Is that a way to put it, or is that?
Say that again?
Would you say that programming or JavaScript is more objective?
Programming in JavaScript, so writing that is more, it's called imperative. It's called imperative style programming, where you're actually like giving the machine instructions that then of course get converted down to machine instructions, versus kind of writing some code that turns into instructions, but you're not actually writing the instructions yourself because it would be too much work. So, we're losing that power on the HTML, CSS side because it would be too much work to do ourselves, right? To animate something or to transition it, too much work. We're just gonna abstract that away from us and just write the end result, which is to do a transition from opacity 0 to opacity 1, so it slowly fades in or something like that, right? Instead of having to draw that ourselves with a loop, right? And so yeah, to answer your question, what I call that, or what many people call that, is imperative versus declarative. Not the agenda of the lecture, but I wanted to review a little bit of that, just kind of remind ourselves why it feels a little bit different and difficult in comparison, right? We're not used to it yet, unless you have a background in it from before. Today, though, once the TV is working, let me get that right. Let me get that up. Today, we're going to be talking about AJAX, right? And we've been working with jQuery a little bit already. Is that right? In terms of some of the stuff that you've been doing, like creating DOM elements, and a little bit of working with forms, or rather like data validation a little bit, right? Yeah? How has that been so far? How has it been dealing with jQuery? Long and verbose? Why did this work, but it's not working anymore? So annoying. So bizarre. Okay, sorry about that. Here we are. Sorry, you were saying? Who was saying? Was it Gary? What were you saying?
Long, kind of, but it's still shorter than the document.
Yeah, jQuery kind of helps us. There's multiple reasons that we're covering jQuery. Some people actually ask us, like, why are you still teaching jQuery? Like, a lot of projects don't use it that start off. There's other libraries that are being used instead. The truth is, it's still one of the most prominent libraries that are out there in the wild in terms of a project that you will inherit. It still does all the things that these other cooler, more modern libraries do. And so it's not about learning jQuery. It's really about how do I go through documentation? How do I use another layer of abstraction over the browser that still uses that browser level code, but then I'm writing something slightly different, right? So I have to be able to relate to the browser, but then be writing one level above in terms of the JavaScript that I'm writing. And so it helps us kind of do that. And then the goal of jQuery itself, like you were saying, Gary, is what is their motto? Like write less, do more, essentially. Basically saying that you can, again, more power by writing some declarative code or by writing things in shorter lines of code, essentially, by doing some of that stuff that we normally do for us. Right? So, okay, AJAX. So AJAX and jQuery are unrelated, as you may or may not know. Right? AJAX is a thing that came about long ago, in the early 2000s, essentially. Essentially, it solves the problem of trying to make web pages behave like applications. Okay. So before AJAX, anything that you did on a website would feel kind of slow and clunky and not really behave like a desktop app. A desktop app was like real time, was highly interactive, right? And there was the era of desktop apps, which is actually what when I went through university, I thought I would graduate from my computer science degree. And the web still wasn't as dynamic, so I wasn't that interested in doing web development. I was interested in working on like hardcore enterprise desktop apps. Right? My career didn't take me in that direction because that was just at the cusp. I was graduating in 2005, and we should have been taught more web in university. We weren't, and that's partially why I also couldn't relate to it. But Facebook was still coming out, like it was still in private, kind of just in universities, and so AJAX and its prominence in the web was still very little. It wasn't as big, right? But really, one could argue that the implementation of AJAX, which actually came out of the Microsoft team, it was actually part of like them trying to make Outlook in the browser and make Outlook behave like a web app. They're like, well, this doesn't really work. It's too clunky. How do we make the browser more like the operating system and have more interactivity instead of just web pages reloading when I click a link? And so really the problem that AJAX is solving is how do I make the page interactive by refreshing it without reloading the whole page? How do I submit data? How do I fetch data behind the scenes? And change, of course, we've seen a little bit of changing the DOM, which isn't really AJAX, that's just changing the DOM, without having to refresh the whole page. So that's essentially AJAX. It's not overly complicated, and I don't want to make it a ceremonious thing where we're like, oh my gosh, we're learning AJAX, it's so hard. It's actually not. It's a relatively simple thing. Okay? There's much other harder things that you've already learned and that you're going to continue to learn in this bootcamp. AJAX, I would argue, is not one of them. So what is it? It's a clever way to load and submit data from a web page without reloading the page. That's pretty much it. So that alone allows us to then build UI and UX that is quite rich and interactive and feels just like desktop applications. In fact, many desktop applications are now being built with HTML, CSS, the stuff that you're learning now, and JavaScript. Maybe jQuery, maybe not, and definitely using asynchronous JavaScript, which is what AJAX essentially stands for. What it stands for is really confusing, actually. Does anybody know? Some of you have done the readings from today. Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. That is what it stands for, which is a really confusing title because XML is not really required as part of the protocol. And so it's kind of misnamed, and it's very confusing. Because most of the time these days when we're actually submitting or receiving data, we're actually getting it through JSON. Right? You've already done a lot of JSON stuff in week 2 with retrieving stuff from APIs. We didn't do any XML. We could have. It's similar. It's just formatted differently. Still a string that comes back. It looks like HTML. Looks like markup. But more prominent APIs these days generally give you JSON and default to JSON, even if they offer XML. So we can just ignore this part, right? It's really just asynchronous JavaScript, which also is, by the way, a terrible name, because JavaScript is asynchronous by nature. So like, thanks, Microsoft, for totally missing the mark on naming this thing correctly. Like we said before, right? Naming things is hard. Really, I would call this something like asynchronous data transfer or something like that, or network requests. It's happening behind the scenes. It's not taking up the entire tab. We don't see it spinning. The whole UI isn't blocked as a result of clicking a link, which is what happens when it's not AJAX, right? You guys with me on this? So an example of this, before we actually implement our own, if I were to bring up a website that's quite interactive, I'm going to just come up with one that I can think of. Let's say Kayak. Okay. So here I have Kayak pulled up. Okay, I'm going to bring up the dev tools and specifically focus on the network tab. Just going to zoom in a little bit here. And if we refresh this page, what do we expect and see in the network tab? What do we expect to see in the network tab if I refresh this page? I expect to see a 1 request, 10 requests. What do you think? Take a guess. 1 request? Because you're going to make a request by making a GET request. But why is it not actually 1 request? Most likely with any web application, really. Yeah, what's the other stuff that it's taking from? There's the HTML, then there's the CSS, which is a separate file usually. Then there's JavaScript, which is a third file, which may be tens of files, or same with the CSS, it may be tens of files. So it really depends on how they've bundled all their JavaScript and CSS. You could do it all in 1 request, but most applications don't, because they don't need to, and it's messy and all of that, unnecessary. So if I refresh here, I'm curious. That's a lot of requests. How many? Where does it say? Right? Lots and lots of requests. And it starts, though, with the first one, which is this particular URL that I've gone to, which is this home page, right? Which is what comes back with HTML. Let's take a look at the response. This is the HTML that comes back. Right? I can view source on it, and that is the HTML that comes back, right? It's quite large, actually. Holy crap. Some JavaScript in there too, but separate JavaScript files, I imagine, as well. It's quite intricate, right? We can see, okay, what are the JavaScript files in here? There's this thing they call combine.js. It must be all of their source code combined in one file, right? We'll learn a little bit about how to do that as well later on in the program. But then there's like combined, but then there's other stuff too. And not all of it's coming from their server. Some of it's coming from, like this analytics thing is coming from, oops, sorry. Is coming from Google Analytics, right? Third-party JavaScript. Some Facebook Connect stuff. You learn a lot about just examining their network tab, eh? And then CSS files as well. And all of this is actually also being loaded asynchronously, right? This is not AJAX, but it's asynchronous loading of scripts and CSS, so that it can, while it's got the HTML and it's trying to paint that, it's also downloading the CSS so it can apply that and get the JavaScript so that it can run that on it as well. So it's not like that's all happening one after the other. That's why we saw those 134 requests load really fast, right? All over a TCP connection, by the way. Recall TCP, right? And then, of course, there's images. So there's a whole bunch of different type of stuff, like even fonts that are being downloaded for a majority of applications that we use today. And that's why we have this filter here to help us see, because there's quite a bit of noise, right? One of them is the XHR. XHR stands for another confusing thing, which is XML HTTP request. I'll just put them as separate things, even though it's all kind of one word. An XML HTTP request is actually another name for AJAX. Again, the wrong name, because it's not XML. And yes, it's an HTTP request, but it's an async one. So it should have been called something like async HTTP request or something like that. And so that's why it's called XHR. And to give you an example of seeing that in action, let's take a look at what happens when I start typing into this box. It behaves like a desktop application in that, well, now what we're used to calling web applications, in that it like live updates with results, right? So if I want to book a flight to like Hawaii, haven't been yet, but I really want to go, right? I start to see results as I type this in. This is autocomplete. Are these results already on the page? No, they have to be fetched in real time. So what we saw, I had cleared the tab below, but now in just typing that, there were like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 AJAX or XHR behind the scenes requests that took place. There were GET requests. Let's actually take a look. Let's take a look at the most recent one, Marvel, whatever that means. If we seek the header, it's something called Marvel, which I have no idea what that is, but it passes in my text that I typed in, where equals kind of partially typed in Hawaii. It's part of the query string, right? And it's a GET, which thankfully came back with a success, right? Lots of data came back, and specifically what came back is actually not HTML, it's just data. So they decided to, in their app, they've implemented also with JSON. And if I look at the response, we can see that it's an array of objects. And it's, this is kind of, we don't have to look at all the details, but it looks like it gives us locations. Here's Hawaii, United States as the first one. There it is, right? The second one is Hawaii with an apostrophe. There it is, right? Volcano National Park, and so on. So it's actually using this data. It turns it into objects and arrays and objects, and then it uses that to use jQuery or some other library to update the document object model, to update the page itself. Pretty cool, right? And we can actually see all those XHR requests. There's this one called list, which we can also use the preview tab here to see more cleanly, which is also JSON. But this one seems like it's not results. What is this? I guess it's like all of the other networks that they use or whatever. Wherever they populate that, I'm not sure. So I wanted to kind of use this as an example to show you what AJAX would look like in the wild before we implement our smaller, easier version of this, right? And jQuery actually, if I Google jQuery AJAX, has a function specifically to help us make a request. Right? Asynchronous HTTP request. It's called AJAX. But before we even look at that, let's look at this thing called XML HTTP request, which is what it was originally called and still is called. Even though it shouldn't be called that. Use these XHR objects to interact with servers. You can retrieve data from a URL without having to do a full page refresh. Again, that is the full value prop. The value proposition of AJAX is this. It enables a web page to update just part of a page without disrupting what the user is doing. So it doesn't block the UI. It doesn't reload the whole page, right? And then they talk about that a little bit. And then there's a link to using it. And here is one kind of way to use it, which is quite verbose and arduous. And so most applications don't use this object directly. They'll use a library like jQuery, or many others that exist, to do these kind of requests, right? So that they don't have to write code in this way by creating a new XML HTTP request object, adding a load event listener on it, and then calling open, then calling send. Like, why do I have to call like 3 different functions to do one thing? Seems a bit too much, right? W03 also has a good introduction to XML HTTP request. We're not going to be using it directly in this lecture or in class, again, because it's not practical, not often done. but it's good to know that it exists. And really, ultimately, this is what jQuery is using behind the scenes. Right? Is slightly different code here, but achieves the same thing. New XML HTTP request, adds an event listener in a different way. And then in this case, they're going further and saying, if it came back with a 200, which also is so verbose, like ready state equals 4, like what is that? Then they're making some change with the response that comes back, right? And here's the actual request being done. So quite messy and arduous. We're not going to be doing it this way. We're going to be using jQuery's AJAX function. Okay. So here's what I was thinking for my demo today. We would create a single page app, much like Tweeter, that retrieves a list of data from the server and updates the DOM, as well can submit data to the server if the form has been filled out, similar to what we have at the top of Tweeter. That I think would be a good exercise, and it would be pretty close to what you're doing for Tweeter, so it would be quite relatable. So let's bring up the code for that. So I have the server.js, which is an Express server. And actually, we're going to be doing both the back end and the front end, because I know that you don't really have to do that for Tweeter, which is good and bad. Like, you can focus on the front end, but then you can't really relate to how the back end is implemented, right? And I'm going to actually work through both. It's not overly complicated, so we should be OK. So this is like a boilerplate Express app, right? We're using some middleware here just to kind of, it's very standard boilerplate to make the app run. This particular one just makes sure that we can get form data coming in when it's submitted. And this one, which we've used before. And then this one is for serving static assets from the public directory, which I believe we've also used before for TinyApp. And then I was just thinking the theme of it would be something like this, like creatures or mythical creatures or something like that. And so here's our array of data there. Right? Just 2 objects for now, and then hopefully users will create more. So it has ID, name, damage, and type. Right? This is kind of what I'd used for this lecture last time. I think it was a good enough example. It worked well. So that's what I've decided to use again. But there's a whole bunch of code missing in terms of how we're going to implement this on the server side. And then on the client side, we have an empty file. So we're going to have to implement that as well. Right? Let's take a look at the index.html, which is going to be the page. So we've got some standard HTML here, just calling it fictional creatures. And there's a form at the top using a bit of Bootstrap. And the form shows like name, type, damage, right? And then has a submit button. And there's just a place for the list of creatures to be loaded into. That's not empty by default, because this is a AJAX-powered application where the data is actually loaded after the fact, much like that list for Hawaii and so on. Any questions so far about what I've shown you before we go start building with this? Done a little bit of that pre-work so we can actually get to the meat of this. No questions? Looks OK? So let's bring this up. It is running on localhost 888. There's our form. The form right now doesn't really do anything except actually it tries to submit the form like this, which is kind of weird. Like if I go like this and I click submit, it actually does this, changes the URL. It's interesting. Let's take a look at that form again before we start implementing. This is the form tag here. Any ideas as to why that's happening? Why is the form just refreshing the page and updating the URL like that? The default method, Andy says, is get. And that is correct. The default method is get, even though it's not supplied here, right? So if we look at forms, If you look at W3 or MDN or whatever, right, there's two major, why don't they have it right at the beginning? Yeah, there's two major attributes. There's the action attribute, which is where it's going to submit. And then there's the method, which is get or post. And it defaults to get, right? So essentially we have form already defined there by default. Right? But we need it to be a post, because we're going to be doing a post. We'll come back to this, though. And then action is where it's going to submit. Right? And so right now it's just submitting to itself, because we haven't specified which other page which other path to submit to. Cool. So we're going to have to start off with maybe just a list and actually populate the list with data. But we're going to work incrementally. You know my style on this stuff, right? It's not just about getting to the end result. It's about the process on how you get there. So what should we be writing in our app.js? Maybe we should just start off with a simple console log just to make sure the app.js is actually working and loading, right? This is like, it seems trivial, but I bet you many of you still don't do this, and maybe pay for it later sometimes. Happened to you yesterday. There you go. So let's take a look and have our network tab open with console. I'm going to hit refresh. Oh my gosh, nothing. So actually, it happened to me too. It was deliberate. And it's happening because somebody other than Andy? Gary says we haven't linked it. Exactly. Like, good guess. We have a link to jQuery here at the bottom of our page. What we don't have is a link to our app.js, which is inside the JS folder. If I forgot to do that, I expect to see an error because it's not on app.js. It's on under public, under js/app.js. And so I expect an error here. Not found, right? But if I change it to js/, I expect no error. Well, let me actually clear it, refresh, no error, and I see my console log working. Right? Before I start writing any jQuery, I better have a file that works. Cool. One of the first things that people tend to do when they're working with jQuery or front end in general, most of the time, is that they end up writing something that is called document ready, which you're somewhat familiar with already, I believe. So I'm going to go into that. Here's my document ready, which is a verbose or non-verbose way of writing document.ready. It's the same thing, but I'm not going to be writing it in the verbose way since that's unnecessary. Write less, do more. Once you know what the library is actually doing, then you don't have to worry about all those characters. And this really just tells us that the DOM is ready. Okay? And this is not something magically that jQuery does with some tricks. This is just something that the browser actually allows us to look at, and it's called the DOM ready event. So basically, it's adding the DOM ready event listener onto the document itself. And when that fires, this function of ours, this callback function of ours will fire. So we have that. And it's like a few milliseconds after the hello from app because it takes a little bit of time, right? Now what? Well, now I can maybe make my attempt at fetching that data, right? And so the question is, how do I do that? I could use that XML HTTP request object that you saw earlier that's provided by the browser. I'm not going to do it, but just to prove that it's available, we can see that it's there, right? It's a function, and we can't see the code for it. It's browser code. It's not JavaScript code. And we could, do something like and then we have our XML HTTP request object that we could use. And it has a bunch of different properties like status and what the response text was and so on. And it starts off as empty. So it's kind of a old school style where it's not a promise. It has all of these things pre-populated with empty string. Like, it just feels a little bit clunky, and It was what the specification was at the time, right? It was written a long time ago. And so for that time, it was great and it was innovative. But patterns have changed in terms of how we write our JavaScript. And jQuery has given us better options, and other libraries even better options, right? So we're actually going to use jQuery for this, as we saw earlier, right here, jQuery AJAX. So let's scroll down. The documentation for jQuery is quite verbose. And I don't particularly like it. It's quite, I don't know, it's hard to read. And in this case, quite long for this page. Like, why am I jumping into all of these details right now? It's a good reference, I guess. But then we get to the actual description. Some examples as well. So here's an example that they give you, which is you use the AJAX, right? And you give it an object with some information. And the URL is of course required because it needs to know where to go. Where do I fetch? Right? In our case, we're going to be fetching JSON data, not a PNG file. So let's go ahead and try that. We need to grab the file from, let's say, /creatures.json, something like that. That's going to be our endpoint. We're kind of building something similar to that cats API, right? On the server side, we haven't built it yet, so I don't expect this to work. What if I just leave it there and I don't do anything else? Like, I know the documentation is asking me to do more, but I just want to kind of learn what happens if I just do that. Maybe that's the only required part. Let's see. Let's go back to our page. Let's clear this. Make it a little bit less zoomed in. Network tab, because I expect there to be maybe an AJAX request, right? And boom, there's an AJAX request. How do I know? I'm specifically looking at the AJAX or XHR tab here, right? And I do see creatures.json being requested. And I get back this, which actually looks familiar. You remember this from the Tiny App days? Cannot get. If I try to just go to localhost 8888 creatures.json, I don't get back JSON. I get back text. Just the standard express error for a 404 page, right? So again, that error-driven development approach that you see me doing intentionally, where caused the error, and now I'm going to fix that error. So what do I have to do, you think, to actually make this error go away at the very least? I don't have a creatures.json endpoint on the server side, right? So if I, anything from, no, all good. So I need to actually switch to my server now, take a look, and I have no routes, right? The index routing, in fact, only works because there's a static page or file called index.html. I don't even have an index route. And so I'm going to do app.get, and I want to support creatures.json. Right?
If you just put a creatures.json file with that static.
Good question. That's a really good question from Andy, which is what happens because you're supporting public files, and as long as the file exists, just like with index.html, it should work. And the answer is yes. I could just put an empty file. Oh, sorry, not an empty file, but a JSON file into my public directory /public. And if it's that same name, it'll actually work because of how Express's middleware is working. But of course, I want that to be dynamic, so it doesn't make sense as a static file, because I want it to show 3 creatures if it's been updated in memory, right? But great question. And in order to make the error go away, I can just do this, but then it'll keep spinning because there's no response. Do you remember that from Tiny App? So I should at least, we'll use res instead of request response. And we'll say res dot send hello just for now, right? Restart that server. And when we refresh this now on the page that I'm on, creatures.json, I expect to see a hello. which means that when I go back to my page and clear this and refresh, I don't see a 404 anymore, right? In fact, I see the hello. Right? That's pretty cool. Already getting there, right? But I need to be sending back JSON. How do I send back JSON? As it turns out, Express has a built-in, very easy way of doing that. Instead of saying render and giving it a template, we just say res.json and give the object that we want to give. Let's say an empty array in this case, or an array of 2 empty objects, right? I'm going to go ahead and refresh. Oh, first I need to restart, refresh. And what comes back now is actually previewable because it knows that that's JSON coming back. The response is just that, right? But we know that it's a 2-element array with 2 empty objects. And what that means is I can actually just point to the creatures object that I have defined up here, which has more data, because that's an array of objects as well. When I started this lecture, I said, AJAX is no big deal. Hopefully you can relate to why, or at least from a syntax and execution perspective, no big deal. Really, the challenge with AJAX isn't writing the code to make it work. It's how do you build really engaging and interactive UIs that allow, like solve the problem for the user versus getting in their way. There's definitely too much AJAX or not enough, right? Those kind of things is where the challenge happens. It's on the product side, not on the writing the AJAX side. Now, of course, in a real-world application, we have to write a lot of this code. There's a lot of stuff happening. So there's a lot of management of data and network requests and stuff. So it's not as simple as this. But ultimately, when you get down to making a request, it's not a lot of code. It's not complicated. OK, so what we need to do now is take this code and, take this data and be able to actually have it in our hands in a variable or something so that we can like loop through it, right? So I don't have that here. And as it turns out, there's different ways. jQuery, for what it is, because it's evolved so much over time, the API is actually, there's like 7 different ways of doing one thing, which kind of sucks, which is why some people don't like jQuery. Because it's so old, it has to kind of support the old days of jQuery in case somebody's written code that way, and then it's got the modern way of doing it, right? For example, we learned about promises and we learned about callbacks. Those are 2 different patterns in terms of how to handle asynchronous logic. jQuery supports both, and not only that, it supports both with different syntax. And so it's kind of confusing and annoying. But it does support promises as well. So let's see if there's a .then mentioned here. Look at that, .then. We're familiar with .then, right? Somewhat? So I should be able to do a .then on this, apparently. Let's try it. There's my request. Instead of doing callback, I'm going to do .then with the callback. Right? And I'm just going to, again, I'm working incrementally here. I just want to see if the .then works. I don't even need the data right now. I just want to make sure that I've got a handle on this part. Right? Just make sure that's working. And then go ahead and refresh. I don't need to restart the node server for this. And I expect to see, hopefully, a .then. Yeah, nice. At least that function is being triggered. But I need the data. So perhaps the data will be here. Perhaps it'll be passed into the callback function. So let's console log that. Yeah, actually, I should probably look at the documentation. That's a good point, Andy. Instead of making an educated guess. Oh, let's see here. Function, first argument, you can call it data, they suggest. And that implies that it is the data. And it talks about promise, right? So let's try it out. That's my data come back. I don't even have to, I believe this is not a string. Not only did it fetch the results, it automatically converted it over from JSON to objects for me. Right? To be clear here, this is not a string anymore. It's an array or an object. Right? To be really clear, let's just make sure it is an array. Like if we're doubting that, is it actually an array? Unfortunately, this is how you do that in JavaScript. It's kind of verbose in trying to figure out if something is an array. It is. And so we're getting that back, and that means we can loop over it, right? We can loop over that content. Call it creatures, because we know what's coming back is actually an array of creatures. I don't have to refresh the Node app anytime I'm making changes to the public files. It's just the server files. And yeah, as I loop through, I can see the objects come through. Pretty cool. Any questions so far? We won't do it this way, but there is also just a callback approach. If I go back to the top of the page for this documentation, there's well, you can actually call AJAX with a URL string, which was added in 1.5, that particular style. Or you can call AJAX with just the settings, which is old school, like 1.0. And I guess those are the two that they show, and then they talk about kind of revisions to each later on. And there's like the callback approach too, which is, where is that? Success callback, right? So actually, I don't have to use the .then. I could just say here, URL and success, here's my callback function, right? But we're more comfortable, hopefully, with the idea of using promises and all the benefits that we get from that, being able to chain them, being able to combine them, being able to compose our callbacks really gives us some benefits, being able to test them easier. So we prefer to use those when given the option. So you're going to be expected to use the promise-based approach. Although in our old curriculum, we wouldn't really push that on you because promises came later in the program. But with you guys feeling a little bit more comfortable having practice promises at least a little bit, we're not asking you to create promises, just being able to use .then in this kind of syntax. You're still using a callback, you're just passing it in thereafter. And if this doesn't work, then we would have .catch for errors, right? I guess we don't need the parentheses for the thing. And that's another nice thing about promises is that we can decide, how we want to attach different behaviors to that end result. How do I cause an error to test that code? Because I've written this code and I haven't tested it. That's not good. Throw an error somehow, but how? Above the for loop here? Throw an error how? Oh, throw a new error? Yeah, that's one way to do it. But I'd like it to be more of a realistic error. Like that's me causing the error through code, you're right, but can I cause the error through some kind of circumstance? What kind of circumstance would take us in there? This thing could itself be a wrong path, right? All of a sudden it's changed or it's unavailable. Maybe the server is down. What happens if the server is down? Cancel the server. Actually, you know what? Let me bring the server up so I can refresh the page. Okay, so page is refreshed. I've got the new JavaScript that I've written with the dot catch. I'm going to just like stop the server. Let's pretend there's some kind of outage on the server. What's going to happen here when somebody, oh wait, I have to refresh the page. Damn it, that's not going to work. I need a button to actually execute this JavaScript. So maybe I won't do server is down. Maybe I'll do the URL itself is down by changing it temporarily, right? Like that URL is unavailable, like a 404 or something of that nature, right? Or 500 error. So let's bring this back up. But now, because it's that, it could not fetch it, and we see that it actually triggers our other console log, right? So here we could show them like a nice red alert on the page or some kind of more user-friendly thing. We wouldn't console log. We would maybe use alert or something like that, right? Alert's kind of the more archaic way of doing it, but we'll use it. Object, so that's not ideal. But we can take a look at what comes back here. Dot, maybe we want to take a look and say dot status text. Right? Next, what we're going to do is we're going to actually loop through the creatures and apply some of the stuff that we hopefully spent some time doing yesterday, which is how do I actually append this stuff to the DOM? Right? How do I actually make that work? We're going to do that. And then we're also going to make the form work. But let's take a, what are we at? 57 after. Let's take a 7-minute break. So that'll bring us back here at 11:04 our time in Vancouver. Let's say 11:05. See you back here soon. Thanks. I think we gave a break at the exact same minute.
Got that sense. I feel it. How do I grab it? This is fun. We're going. Actually, I just thought of something. You know how you have your objects and then you grab them like you're dragging with your stuff. Let's say you had like waves, and then each one there was like 10 different types of those, and then inside that there was like subclasses like elites and all those other things. Would you just use a for each loop then to grab each one, like how in the
Potentially.
Like, let's say it was like really,
assuming
really nested.
if it was nested, the question is, do we want in the UI for them to be able to click one and then make another request to grab the rest, or I would nest it up. Right, just because it's not like a whole bunch of code in one. And you'll see me do that in lecture as well, is to split it up into different functions.
Yeah. Stuff fuzzy in that area.
So,
All this designation. Yes.
No.
how about week 1 and 2 stuff?
Still, like,
Right?
unfortunately, I think the problem I don't have the full connection. Like, I haven't used all the methods enough that I know which one should be used. So I'll be like, okay, I need to grab this. What do I do to grab this again? And then I like
Okay, Calgary, we're ready to resume here. Hopefully everybody's back. I'll check in before I resume. Quick audio check. Yep, looks good. Waiting for Calgary. Everybody's back here in Vancouver. Okay, so we left off having the data come back. We also tested the error situation where the URL itself is broken. And so we were able to make sure that our .catch works. But we don't actually have anything changing on the page. Like this page, if I were to zoom out, we haven't done any kind of DOM manipulation. Nothing actually, no new nodes, no new elements on the page. And so we need to start working towards that. It's probably a good idea to just see what that would look like. Like here's my creatures list, right? I would probably want like the end result here to be what, 2 divs or something like that include the creature details or something, right? So what would that look like? Maybe something like div class equals creature. I don't think I have any CSS in this project, no. And then there would be the name of the creature. Maybe that would be in strong. And then there would be maybe what is the other information? The damage and the type. Type and damage. Something like that. And there would be maybe 2 of these. Right. So if I were to refresh, something like that showing up, right? Obviously better styled, but that's not my concern right now. So we need to populate and create these elements, right, programmatically, because the data is coming back once the page is completely loaded. So we don't actually want these divs in here. We want them to be created in some kind of a for loop and then inserted into the DOM, right? So not in the server.js, actually in the client side, in the app.js in our case. So somewhere in here, we're going to need to deal with it. Not in the error situation, but in the success situation. Okay, so I have my creature object. Maybe what I can do is, if I'm writing pseudocode here, I need to do 2 things. Right? I could write this all in line here, but I'm actually going to break it down into functions because that's what we ought to be doing as good developers. So might as well try to build that habit as we go instead of leaving it to the end. But the 2 things I'd want to do is I'd want to create the DOM element, the div that you saw me create earlier. That would be my step 1. And what's step 2? What is step 2? Yeah, so I should probably say create the node with the data. So like what the end resulting div is. And then number 2? Append it. Yeah, exactly. Add it. Append it to the DOM. The first step is actually just creating it in memory. It doesn't actually affect the page. And then we decide when and where we want to add it to the page, which is going to be in that section area that we saw. That's empty. And then right away is the answer for the when, because we need it to, might as well start putting it into the DOM right away. Right? Okay, so I'm actually going to call 2 different functions here because there are 2 different responsibilities, right? Maybe the first one will get me the element, and the second one will actually append the element. Const element equals create creature. Pass in the creature. or maybe I'll be a little bit more verbose here. So it's like, what are you creating? Create creature element, right? And then we pass that element into append or add creature element, and we pass that in. Do these functions exist? No. I expect an error. Yes. Let's make sure that my hypothesis is correct and that I see the error. I should actually see two different, well, I'll see one error because well, I have to fix the URL first, actually, going to the wrong one. So it needs to go into the dot then, which it will now. And we see that actually it still goes into the catch, which is interesting, right? We saw the alert happen when I refresh. But we see that it's trying to do the dot then. Because this time the error is reference error, create creature element is not defined. Right? So we need to define that function. I can define it up here. I can define it in here. That's our creature data, right? And it's going to return. It's going to return a jQuery element so that it can be added to the DOM. And then add creature element. So now I expect this one to give an error. Thanks for catching that. So far, is this helpful? And it's a good review of yesterday as well, right? The stuff that we kind of had to do in terms of looping through the data and populating it into the DOM, right? Is it too much review?
No, actually, there's one question that I'm hoping you'll get to.
OK, you want to ask it now while I'm waiting? Looks like they're back, but I'll.
It wasn't clear. I wasn't clear to me anyways, but that whether the create function should return just like fully formed HTML template literal, or whether it should be built programmatically.
Yeah, we'll talk about both approaches actually. In my previous lecture, I actually built so the question was like, should it return the object or should it return like a string of the div? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, I did it just in like the backtick.
You can decide, because you could argue that there's three functions here. One is to create the string, then is to take that string and turn it into an object. I think two is enough, and you'll see me kind of show both approaches actually. Yeah. OK, Calgary's back, so hopefully we can continue. And what I was saying here is that we're working error-driven development. We haven't done too much actual implementation, so I don't think Calgary's missed much. But add creature element is now not working because we're calling this function add creature element that doesn't really do anything. And by the way, our create creature element is still empty, right? So, in fact, I'm just going to comment this out and just console log element, right? Like, let's go even smaller steps instead of trying to jump the gun a little bit. Kind of pull the brakes on trying to do two functions at the same time and realize maybe I should just do the one, console log its result, make sure I feel good about that. What do you think that console log is going to be right now, given that this function looks like this? It's going to console log undefined, right? Because the function is returning undefined. So let's just go ahead and let's see that in action first. So no more error, but I get two undefineds. Why do I get two undefineds? Because I'm doing this in a loop, and the loop has two creatures. So that function is called twice, right, Jared? OK, so what should this function actually do? It should return an actual DOM element. So what's the simplest DOM element I could create with jQuery? Remember, work incrementally. Don't try to solve the entire problem. That's an important question. What is the simplest DOM element I can create with jQuery? I just want to see something happen to make sure that my console log is no longer undefined. I mean, of course, I could just return a number here, but that's not really what the goal of this function is. It's not to return numbers. So I can create DOM elements using this syntax, right? The $ syntax, which is essentially the jQuery function. And I can just pass in something like this, right? Now when I refresh, I see that I actually get 2 divs. It's actually a collection of elements, but really it has only, it's like that node list that Nima was talking about yesterday. But it's really just one node, one div, right? Each, so 2 divs in total. And yeah, we could put some stuff in that div, right? It has that text inside. But we want to see it. Can't see it. It's not there. It's not appended to the DOM. Right, Will? It's not there. So what am I going to do? I could continue implementing this function, but I've given it a good stub in that it's doing a fake version of what it needs to be doing. So now I'm going to actually implement the next function. This is my style anyway. It doesn't have to be your style. But like, now I'm actually going to create the other function. What is it called? Add creature element, which doesn't really return anything. It actually just takes that element and adds it to the DOM. Okay? So what that's going to do is it's going to, we could just append it to document body, like right at the end of the body. It's not what we want to do, but we could. We could use append from jQuery to do that. There's multiple ways of doing this in jQuery. The other is to just take the element and append it to document body, which also does the same thing. Like it's the opposite. You take the thing and then you append it to the other thing, or you take the list and then you append into it the element that you want. We can just go with whichever approach we feel comfortable with. I feel comfortable with this one. It's good enough. Let's see that work. So now I expect 2 divs to be at the bottom of the document body. What is the document body, by the way? This is document body, right? So it's going to append it, which means it's going to go right here. Make sense, Chai? Let's see that work. I haven't done anything on the server side. I don't need to restart my Node app. Refresh. Nothing really seems to have changed here. So maybe it didn't do what I thought it would do. Let's take a look at the inspect here. Didn't really work. Why didn't it work, guys?
In your app, you still have the add comment.
Exactly. Need to actually call the function, right? So now I'm passing in that jQuery div into add creature element, and it's actually being called. Let's refresh. Immediately on page load, because we're running our fetch immediately on page load, all of this stuff is working. And we see right at the end of the document body, name is being added. But we want these to be not in here. We want these to be in here. Really, I can't add it into there? That's annoying, eh? It's an empty thing, so I can't add it in there. But you get the idea. It should go into the creatures list, right? So instead of document body, I actually want to grab the thing with the class creatures list and then append to that. And I'm using jQuery to turn that into a jQuery object because append is a function on jQuery object. Right?
Would you want to be, how would you decide whether to just grab it by the class or grab it, be more specific, like grab it by the section with the class?
The question from Andy, which is a good question, it's a very open-ended question, very deep question, which is how do you decide how to select the thing that you're trying to insert into? How specific should you be? And this is actually what leads to a lot of people being confused because there's no really one right answer. And if you, depending on which project or team you join, they're going to have different conventions, right? They may actually be very specific here and decide to use an ID. They may decide to use section.creatureslist. They may try to like not just directly call it out and actually like use like this dot closest thing dot append. There's different patterns, and so it really depends on like how your app is architected and how the team, kind of what the style that within the team is, and so what's already written in the app, right? And it's also, this is kind of a little bit of foreshadowing, it's also the reason, this confusion is also one of the reasons why we have libraries and frameworks that emerge, like React and Vue and Angular and so on, because there's just not enough structure on this stuff. It's all like, do what you want, and so it ends up leading to a lot of confusion and different solutions. And so it requires a little bit more of a mental framework, and things like React give you a little bit more, which is what the other cohort is going through right now here in Vancouver, which is a little bit more like, this is how you kind of do it, right, on this. Yeah, the term would be opinionated and directed, perhaps, That's what a framework is, right? A framework gives you opinions. It gives you a process. This is how we do it. This is the way we should be doing it. Nothing here, jQuery is not a framework. jQuery is just a library. React is a framework. It's a library that gives you the way to do things as well. Not just what function to call, but actually how to manipulate the DOM, right? But a lot of code out there doesn't use React or its alternatives like Vue or Angular. They just use this. This is old school, but it's also quite common in the wild, right? So this is why we're still teaching you this before getting to React. If we just jump straight to React, you'd be like, I don't really understand what's happening underneath. And also you'd be missing out on some of that low-level stuff that you may need or will likely need on the job. So let's go ahead and get this working, because it's not fully there yet. It's just an element that's a div with the word name in it. We see that it is working, but not completed yet. And when I inspect these, they're in the right section. They're being appended to the right section. Is this working incrementally process working okay for you in terms of understanding what I'm doing and why I'm doing it? This is how I expect you to be working yesterday and going forward. If you're not doing that because the tutorial or walkthrough is not getting you to do that or you're not comfortable, force yourself to do it anyway. Okay, work incrementally. It's about the approach, not the end result right now. Okay, so we need the div to actually show the creature name and stuff like that. So I actually need a little bit more content in here. How do I go about doing that? There's many different ways. Once again, there isn't a single way. But I'm passing in a string here, and the string needs to have name. But the name actually needs to be the name of the creature. So what could I do with the simplest way? Sorry? Template literal. Yeah, I could just do string concatenation or string interpolation using template literals. Not the best approach, but it could work. Let's just put in data dot, what are the properties that come back? Dot name. Let's just see that work. Right? This is not recommended. It's okay for now, but there are actually problems with this. There are security problems with this. So production level web apps, you could do it for Twitter, but production level web apps will not do this, otherwise they're exposing a security thing. I'm not going to go deep into it, but essentially you are trusting that code, that name, and somebody could have inserted like a script or like HTML in there. And so now you're actually adding HTML without realizing it, which means they could add a script tag with JavaScript and actually start like writing JavaScript, which at that point they could, grab all the cookies and submit them to some other website. Right? They could potentially get sensitive information about your website because you are submitting things without sanitizing it. So there's a security issue here, which is why the right way to do this is to sanitize the input, either yourself or use jQuery to do that for you. And so the way to use jQuery to do that for you is to use .text to say, I am giving you text. Don't let this be HTML, please. Right? And give it the data.name. Whoa. What did I screw up there? data text data dot name. So I'm saying build the div, but don't return just the div. I want to actually also call dot text on it to append text to it, or to add text to it. It doesn't append; it actually replaces the text. This will do the same thing, but it's safer. Same result, right? And just to make sure that it's working. But I don't want it to just be a div. It needs to have like a whole bunch of other stuff inside, like a strong, right? So how do I do that? If I do this, to put the name in here, I can't just use .text because it's going to replace the inside of the div with the text. And if I try to do text with HTML, like let's say I use a template literal here to say, oh, the text is going to be strong name. Guess what will happen there? Well, this is supposed to sanitize the input. So it's not going to accept HTML. It's not going to do what we think it's going to do. It's not going to bold that. It's actually going to treat it like text. It's going to escape it. And so we can't do that. But if I do this, oh, and by the way, this was supposed to be the $, right? But if I do .html, I can get it to work, but I'm effectively, again, trusting this data to be good, clean HTML and not something malicious. So not ideal. OK, so come back to text. But now, can't put strong in there. So no need to make it have a string interpolation. Just go straight with the text that we need to have there. And maybe we don't put it into the div itself. We actually put it into a strong, right? So we're actually going to have const name equals strong, which will have the text data name. And then we will take our div, create it, right? But before we return the div, we're also going to append name to it. Because we know name is safe. We've created it safely. Again, you can choose to still use template literals in Tweeter, and then later convert it over to this if that's what you prefer. It's a little annoying to do it this way. The template literals is much easier, right? But it has a security flaw. And so you wouldn't want to do that with production code. It's OK for like a hackathon. It's OK for a demo day. It's OK for a final project. But you should know that there's a security issue in it. Right? So here we are. It's working. And it's safe. And we need to actually have more information in here, right? It's not just name. We also need to append additional text, right? So we can call that details. What the hell's details? Perhaps it's another bunch of inner DOM elements, such as maybe an EM. Could be another div, could be anything. And in that EM, we're going to add text data dot, what is it? Type and damage. And it's just text, so I can do some string interpolation here. Here's my type, and here's my damage. So let's zoom out a little bit here and see what's happening. I'm creating the inner stuff first, which is the name and the details. And then I'm creating the outer container, which is the div itself that's going to represent the creature. And then before I return it, I make sure I append those two elements into it. So it's going to end up being a div with a strong and an EM in it that gets returned. Got to put some brackets in there. Right. Maybe a space beforehand. Let's see that in action. And if we inspect this, we see that indeed it is a div. It's strong elem div. Right. Did this make sense? And maybe I want to add some CSS styling to this div, so I could give it a class right here. That's acceptable. There's nothing wrong with that. But maybe that class is dynamic based on the type of the creature. Maybe it's like creature-dragon, creature-whatever. It needs to be dynamic, in which case I can do an add class so that it's more dynamic. It doesn't have to use string interpolation here using template strings. Instead, I can just say add class, and in here I can say creature-data.type. So now it's going to be creature-whatever that type is. Right? Oh my God, this is getting to be a long line of code. So the approach here is to just nest these, just like with promises with the .then and .catch, is to just do it like this. Remember the semicolons are important here. We're not going to have semicolons here because this line is continuing. It has to be semicolon at the end here. OK, let's take a look. You can see, maybe I should have downcased this, but essentially you can see that I've got creature and then creature flying, right, as my classes. It actually appends the class name. It doesn't replace the class, which is nice. Any questions so far about this? We still have to implement the form, so I'd like to move on to that step now. Right? We are fetching the data. Now we need to be able to submit the data. So how do I handle that? Because right now my form is not working. If I submit, it just refreshes the page. It adds that data to the URL, but it's not actually doing this asynchronously, and it's refreshing the page. I want to stop. I want to implement the asynchronous submission, and I want to stop it from refreshing the page. It should not refresh the page. It should be like in Slack. When I send a chat message, it doesn't reload all of Slack. Right? How do I do that? Well, I have this form here. Right, let's give it some kind of an ID or a class. If I could only type. Something like that. Oh, and of course, the method and the thing are important as well. But let's actually just do this for now. New creature form. And in my app.js, I'm going to say, well, I need to get a handle on this form. And so it's a class-based form. So I'm going to use dot notation. And there's the form that I have, right? Let's just make sure that's what I have. There it is, the form. And I'm going to say when this form is submitted, I want to actually do something. I want to use a callback function and do something in JavaScript. I don't want it to do the default browser behavior of trying to submit the form in the way that browsers submit forms. I want to hijack that. So form.onSubmit, just like button.onClick, just like div or any other element.onClick or mouse over or other kind of events that we have, we're going to implement a onSubmit handler to handle the submit of the form because we want to be doing something special with it. We're going to be doing it with AJAX. Right? So here's my console log to just make sure that that's working. Let's clear my console here and hit refresh. OK, so I don't see that yet. It's because it's supposed to be on submit. So let's go ahead and submit. And we see that it's about to submit form. But then it does a full page refresh, which we need to stop. We don't want it to do that thing. And the way we're going to do that is there's a couple ways. The more conventional way is to have a handle on the event and say event.prevent default. Please don't do the default behavior event. Don't let this event propagate up to the browser, where the browser will cause the form to submit through a GET request. So that, you can say you can say event, whatever you prefer. That will stop it from doing that behavior. Let's make sure. So now our page is not reloading. So let me just show you the exact implications of that. Here I am on my page. no kind of URL change. And then when I click submit, I've clicked it 6 times. I see that, but nothing changes on the URL side. Right? So I have full control now of the form. It does not cause any browser behavior. What am I going to do here is I'm going to make an AJAX post request to the server. AJAX post jQuery. Oh, look at that. I can use AJAX. I can use post. So .post is really just a convenience method. They also have .get, which is really just going to use the AJAX. This is shorthand AJAX function, which is equivalent to, please make a post to the given URL with the given data, and here's the success callbacks and so on, right? And so we can use a .post or we can use the .ajax. It's up to us. Let's go ahead and use .ajax so we kind of have more control, but we can shorten it up a bit later if we want. So this AJAX is going to be to the URL, let's say /creatures, because we're going to submit to creatures. And the method, where is it? .ajax. Sorry, the type will be set to post. Right? And then it's like, well, what's the data? OK, I'm just going to fake the data a little bit. I'm just going to say data is A is equal to 1. OK. And again, I need my .thens and my .catches, but I'm working incrementally here. I just want to see the request happen first. Why is it complaining about trailing spaces? OK, let's try that. So form is submitted. We make an AJAX request every time. Let's try it. This is very similar to what would be in Slack, for example. Every time we submit a chat message, it would be doing a .post or .ajax with post. I don't see it. Did I screw something up? Refresh. Ah, there we go. Oh, that didn't work so well. $.ajax URL blah blah, and about to submit form. Oh, I did do the post to creatures right there. We can see that it attempted the AJAX. If we look in our network tab, we see creatures. Let's try submit again. It doesn't seem to be doing. Oh, I need to preserve log here because I want to see all the requests and not just have them. What's happening here is that the JavaScript is breaking. And because it's breaking, it's not preventing default. And so it's still submitting the form with a GET request. So it's reverting to its old behavior. And I want to be able to see what's going wrong. So this is kind of a debugging tactic that I didn't expect to do, but it's good. So let's go ahead and submit. I can see that it actually does do a post to creatures. But then something goes wrong. Something goes very wrong. And it just like causes a JavaScript error of some sort. And as a result, it, oh, it's because I forgot where did my event prevent default go? Whoops, I accidentally deleted it, that's why. Right, if you don't prevent default, it's still going to try and submit the form in the usual way. So now it's doing the AJAX as well as the regular form submission. It did both, right? This is important to stop it from doing the default behavior. OK, now try again. Yeah, we see that it's a failed post. So that will go into the .catch, right? We need to implement this. But also, I'm curious what it's actually sending up. Let's check. The headers, here's the request. And we can see that the form data includes A:1. It includes the key value pair there. Let's actually just make sure this data is coming through to the server and implement the server side for this. We don't need to actually fix this right now. We can work with it. So I need to support a post request, which is for creatures. All right, we'll just console log request.body. Want to see what's coming in? Sorry. Wow. I want to see what's coming in. So here it is. And then I'll just send back like a Thank you. Right? Like, really nothing, just so that it doesn't hang. Let's restart the server. And we'll keep an eye on what happens when we hit submit here. So let's hit submit. And we see that we get back the A1 coming up to the server. Right? Of course, it should be the creature data. It should be what's in the form. It should be these three fields: name, type, and damage. So the question is, how do I get those to be sent up? Any ideas? I need those three properties or pieces of information to go up. So that when the user has typed in a name and a type and the amount of damage, that is actually the data that's going up. Currently, it's not. It's just sending A1. Say that again? Well, the event object is, hey, the form was submitted, right? And so, or sorry, the form is attempting to be submitted. And that just gives me details about that event, like what caused it. Was it a mouse click or something like that? What element is it being triggered on? It's being triggered on the form. I could fetch that information. And yes, I guess I could go from the event to the form, but then I still have to like read the data from the form, right? So each of those inputs. Yeah, Calgary is giving the right answer, which is a little bit more. I wanted to get to that answer, but the more annoying way of doing this, which you'll find sometimes in the wild, is that each of these is fetched. The value of each of these is fetched. Okay, so let's do it that way first, and then we'll use serialize, which is the better way of doing it. So there's three fields here. I'm going to give these all a class so that they're easier to fetch. So this one's called the creature name. Oh, do they? But that's just, oh yeah, you're right. They do have class, so I'm just going to say creature name here. It's a form control, so that's a bootstrap class. And then creature type. And then creature damage. And what I'm going to do is, instead of passing the data like this, I'm going to decide what the keys are. So name. What is it? Type. And damage. That's essentially what I want to send up. And I'm going to grab the value. I'm going to grab the value from it. So I'm going to say, get me the, what is it? Creature name input field. And I can use jQueries.val to fetch the value of that input field. Right? That's what the user typed in. All three of those, and if there was 5, I would have all 5. I don't need to restart, so I don't know why I did that. And let's go ahead and refresh. Let's clear our network tab. We don't need to preserve that log. Let's hit submit. We see that a submit still happens. And empty values, but the keys are there. And if I put in data here, let's give it a more creative one. What's a good name for a creature? I think KV is a good name for a creature. Type, damn straight. Okay, submit. Here's my second request that took place. The page did not reload or anything like that. Click on that network request, and I see that data going up. And I also see it in the log, because I'm console logging the request body as it's coming through. So at this point, I've got the data, and I should be able to add it to the array of creatures that I have on the server side, right? So this is my creatures on the server side. Let's actually go ahead and say const creature equals new object, and it has name, request.body.name, type, request.body.type, and damage, request.body.damage. And then we're going to add that to the array. So this is just our, week 1 JavaScript, our focal stuff here. Creatures dot push creature to add this new object into the array. So now this object's been updated, right? Let's restart that and take a look. So here we are. Huh? Smog? Yeah, nice. What type of creature is a smog? Is that from, that's from Lord of the Rings, right? Yeah. Oh, is it the Hobbit? Yeah, the Hobbit. But I guess also makes an appearance in Lord of the Rings? Right? It's been a while. Huh? Oh, we don't want to do, yeah, no spoilers. Forgot about spoilers. Lots of damage. And let's go ahead and submit that. So that goes to the server. The server says all good. There's no errors on the server side. If I refresh the page here, nothing changes here in my data, right? Like my list doesn't change because I haven't refetched the list. If I refresh the page, it's going to make a request, and it's going to be able to get that change. But it would be nice if it was like Slack, where if I submit it, I actually see the change on the page as well, right? I don't have to refresh Slack to see the changes that I make, right? To see the messages that I submit. I just hit refresh on the page. I clicked literally the refresh button. So that's not real time. It's not showing me, it's not behaving like a single page app in the way that Twitter ought to, or in the way that Slack does, for example, right? So what we're going to do is, we're going to need to fix that so that when I submit, it actually refreshes this as well, right? Any ideas for that? How do I make it so that when I submit something, it also gets me the latest data at the bottom there without having to refresh the page? Yeah, without having to require the user to refresh the page. Sockets? No, that's going a little advanced. Sockets is an approach as well, but you don't need to use sockets for this. It would be overkill. Sockets is for like when you want to see all changes come from everybody. This is, I want to see my change refresh. Prevent default? Well, that would be kind of hacky. So the question from Andy is, what if you take away event prevent default, which will cause the page to refresh? But we don't actually want the app to be clunky still. We don't want it to refresh the whole page because the user could still be doing other things on this page, right? Just like when you're on Facebook. Can we still relate to Facebook these days? And there's that chat in the bottom, right? We don't want the whole page to refresh just to see the new chat message because we could be doing other things on Facebook. So I just want that list, that div, to refresh. What do I do? Anything from Calgary? Yeah, Russell's onto something. So after the AJAX request, we don't have any .thens or .catches. So first of all, we're not doing any .thens or error handling, which is bad. We should be doing that in our client code right here. Here's the AJAX, and we're going to do a .then. Right? What do we need to do at that point? We need to refresh the page. Or sorry, refresh the list. So we can say something like load creatures is what we need to do. Right? Oh, and then if there's a problem, we need to handle that as well. But we'll for now just console log, or we'll just alert failed to submit creature data. Could do something more here. We could, put alert in the DOM itself, but I'm just being lazy with my error messaging. But yeah, we're gonna load the creatures. What the hell is that? That's a red underline because it's a function that doesn't exist. So it'd be nice if I had a function that could fetch all the creatures and add it to the DOM. Do I already have something like that? Don't I? Don't I do that at the page load? I get all the creatures and I add them to the div. So can't I just call that function load creatures? Or fetch creatures, maybe? Right? Let's try it. This is what I'm doing here. The problem is that it's happening on page load. It's happening in the document ready. I need it to happen in a function. So what do? I create a function. It doesn't need any input in this case. And this whole AJAX call is now going to be inside this function. Right? And the indentation's off a bit, so it's complaining. There we go. And so we're making our AJAX call, just like before, but it's now inside of a function, which means that I need to call said function, right?
So you would need to call it on page load and again when they.
I need to call it on page load, and I need to call it, and I'm automatically already calling it with my .then above, right? So here, after I define the function, I'm immediately going to call it for the page load. Because otherwise, I'm not actually doing it on page load. So let's see this work. Let me restart it just in case. Shouldn't have to. Upon load of the page, so I'm hitting refresh, I should see this come in. And then upon submitting something, I expect the data to load. Look at that. It's working-ish, right? Working-ish is still good. What's the problem? It's appending. It's assuming that the function we wrote was not really thinking about the future use of itself. It was just like, oh, I'm going to be called once, so I can just append. But it's supposed to be called multiple times, and it shouldn't append, it should replace the inside, right? So let's take a look at so here we have fetch creatures, and there's the code for all of these. It's appending, which makes sense because we're adding one at a time to the div. But maybe what we can do, and there's multiple implementations here. I'm getting the entire response back from the server with all of the new creatures, right? I'm not just getting the latest one. And so it's going to loop through all of them again, right? So I can just say, well, I know that my div already has stuff in it, so that kind of sucks. And I want to reuse this code. I don't want to have to write different code, right, in this case. So what can I do? I'm not going to tell you the answer here. In this approach, what can I do so that I don't have to modify fetch creatures too much, in that it's like looping through and appending? I don't want to change the server side either because I'm making a separate request. So what happens is when I submit, I forgot to show you this. When I submit now, let's clear this. It's two requests because first it does the post, and then when the post is successful, it does a fetch, right? Because I did in my .then, I said, please go ahead and fetch, which is the other AJAX request. So every single one is two requests. And the second request brings back all of the data, all 6 that are in there right now. So there's one change that I could make that Andy is suggesting, which is, let's just not get back everything from the server, but then I'm not using, my creatures.json endpoint anymore. I could just get back the data that I added. But it'd be nice to just say, give me the whole thing, because somebody else could have made a change while I'm working on this. I'd like to see that change too while I'm refreshing. Right? So give me the list as it is now. It's just not just my stuff that I added, but any stuff that was added. So I think we do want all of this back. But as soon as we have it all back, we loop through it, and then we're appending it to this div, this section. What can we do instead? Replace it, but the problem is this code is using append, right? So if I say replace here, if I do this, right, which is effectively replace, it's not, because I'm looping through each, I'm only going to get the latest creature in there. I'm not going to get all of them. How about I just empty the element list, and then I start appending to it, right? So in here, before my for loop, right in here, I'm going to, I'm going to clear that list. So dot creature list. Whoops, sorry. Dot. You could do .html like that, right? Or jQuery empty HTML, and we see they thought about that because it's a common need, and they have a .empty. Remove all child nodes from the DOM. So this is one way of doing it. This is not the only way, because we could have also just fetched partial data and then not had to empty out the list, right? So let's go ahead and see this in action. Refresh. Here's my list, because I restarted the server. See it there. And if I hit refresh on the page, I also get to see the data, because refresh also causes the page load to fetch. Right? Now here I can start being clever and do some nice UI things that don't take a lot of effort. For example, right before it's fetching, why don't we, either using jQuery or using CSS, why don't we take that creatures list, and add class loading. And once it's got the data, then we can remove class loading. And what is class loading going to do? Maybe it's going to fade it out and fade it back in, so that the user can actually feel like something's changing here, right? The way I would do that is ideally in a CSS file, but I don't have a CSS file, so I'll just do it in here. I'm just going to add some style. And I'm going to say anytime something has the class loading, because I can attach it to anything, I would like it to have an opacity of 0.3, right? I should probably also make it so that I just know that the creature div itself has a transition everything by, what is it again? Is it transition, and then you give it what you want to transition? So I want to transition the opacity over 2 seconds. So that's going to be the creature list, right? Because the whole list is going to be loading or not loading. I think it's called creature list. Is that right? Creatures list. Creatures list. So the creatures list, anytime opacity is changed, please transition it over, let's say, 1 second, right? And let's actually slow down our request a little bit so that we can see this happening. So in our get, we don't want to just quickly send back the JSON, because maybe it's like, it's too fast. We're not going to see it, right? So what we'll do is we'll just simulate it a little bit, that it's going to take some time. Right? Maybe it's going to take about a second, maybe 2 seconds. Kind of long, but so be it, just to see that work. Not working. Oh, I guess it just takes a while, right? And we see it fade in. And then now when I put something in, fades out, fades back in, right? Not too much code. And a combination of using CSS transitions and adding classes and removing classes, because I'm adding the class right before making the request, and I'm removing that same class when the request comes back. These are things that weren't part of my lecture, but I just, it doesn't take a lot to throw that in there once you're comfortable with it. It's 12:01, but I did start a little bit late, so I'd like to spend another 2-3 minutes with you guys, if that's okay, and really just wrap this up. So overall, I think I achieved showing you how to make a single page app, similar to Tweeter, pretty quickly, without all the styling and all the other stuff that we have to do around it, all the validation, form validation, things like that. But I built a kind of a proof of concept that works, that you could use if you need to refer to it. In that process, I kind of showed you how to work with jQuery's AJAX function. Now, the truth is, you don't have to use jQuery's AJAX function to make a get. You can use jQuery's get to make a get request. right? Which is a slightly nicer way of writing this, so it's not as verbose. Okay. Then there's even jQuery's get JSON, which is even more like another helper function to essentially do a get with type JSON. So this would be something I would maybe use for my fetch creatures, is to just say get JSON instead of .ajax. It does the same thing, though, essentially, by making the call like this. Okay? So it saves us having to use more lines of code to specify that it's a type JSON. The other thing I want to kind of talk about is kind of stuff that's not going to be needed for you to know about right now, but is good to just know as people who are going to be working in industry. More has changed since jQuery was introduced. One of the things that was actually implemented across all the browsers is something called fetch. So fetch is actually a more modern approach to making AJAX requests. It's been built in the last few years, and it's actually now, I believe, supported in all major browsers. Not as prevalent, but pretty prevalent. So we see here, for example, it says it's not supported in Internet Explorer. That's because Internet Explorer was kind of updated to be Edge. So this is old IE, and then this is new IE, right? So even there, it's supported across the board. And how it works, actually, it provides an interface for fetching resources and cruising across the network. It will seem familiar to anyone who has used XML HTTP request, which we just used indirectly using jQuery. But a new API provides a more powerful and flexible feature set. So they basically said, this XML HTTP request is like kind of outdated. It doesn't use promises. Let's actually just build one that's cross-browser, that's in the specification, that people can use. And that's called fetch. So let's take a look. They have examples here, maybe. Not so good. Fetch, maybe W3 has better examples. Or this is Google's thing. They're like, oh, look how bad this is. Let's use fetch. Pretty damn simple. Even simpler than jQuery, one could argue, right? And it's promise-based by default, whereas jQuery doesn't use native promises. It uses its own type of promise called the deferred, which kind of fakes that it's a promise, but it's not the native promise that we get from JavaScript. So this is as native as it gets. This is using the browser directly. It's also going to be likely faster in terms of, you're not using another library. And now you don't necessarily need jQuery to be able to make AJAX requests in a clean way, which is nice. You're not expected to use fetch for your Twitter project, but I wouldn't be surprised if, knowing this now and writing it down as something to research, you are going to potentially use it for your midterm project for when you're making AJAX calls.
So this is cross-browser support.
You don't need to install anything. It's built in. So I can open up any page in Chrome or Firefox anywhere, and I can see that there is a fetch, right? And I can start using it to, for example, fetch. What was the cat API? The cat API breeds right here, right? This is JSON coming back. So what happens if I do this? Whoops, sorry. So we see there's data coming back. In fact, let me just show you. The way you actually grab the data out of it is response.json.then. So we would say then response console log actually it's a little bit involved, so you'd actually do .then. In here we would say return response.json, and then .then we have our data. Oh, we console log that. It's a little bit less clean. It's a little bit more powerful, and therefore you need multiple .thens, or you could do it a different way. But ultimately, it's not a lot of code to do the thing that we're trying to do here. And here's our cat data coming in, right? So fetch is really interesting. There's another library that you'll learn later called Axios. And Axios is another very popular library for making promise-based HTTP requests asynchronously. In fact, it says it right there. And basically allows you to make those XML HTTP requests from the browser. Also works in Node, so you don't actually just have to use it. You don't have to use it just in the browser. Supported across the board, and fairly easy to use. So I just wanted to show you that jQuery isn't. We're not here to learn jQuery. We're not even here to learn Axios or fetch or things like that. It's about understanding the landscape. It's about knowing that you can kind of look for alternatives, and you may not be working with jQuery, but it's not just about, hey, let me learn jQuery so I can put it on my resume and I can use it. It's really about understanding AJAX and being able to use it and understanding all the different ways that you can do it. Right? Any questions about any of this stuff?
So how would we decide whether to use Axios or jQuery or fetch?
The question from Andy is, how would we decide whether to use Axios or jQuery or fetch? And the answer is that oftentimes you're not the one deciding. The truth is. Chances are, if things go well, you're not the ones deciding when you take a job. Right? Because as junior developers, you're likely, hopefully, going to inherit existing code and work within a team that's got some people that are more experienced. So either they've already made that decision, or if they're going to make that decision, maybe they'll loop you in, but they're going to make that decision, and then you're going to run with it. In terms of how are they making that decision, they're looking at various different things. For example, if they're working within React, there's a lot of general just community orientation towards using Axios. It does certain things nicer that work well within React's kind of framework, right? So fewer people use jQuery to make AJAX requests within React, but not unheard of either.
So it becomes kind of like you are able to make an informed decision the more experience that you have.
The more experience you have, you kind of work with React, you know that Axios is going to solve certain things for you, and you kind of know that you've been burnt by not using it before, and therefore you use Axios. Or because you just see it everywhere in the React community, and you're going, there must be a reason I'll use it, right? It doesn't, no harm in picking that, because it's not like I have to learn a lot of new API. It's just a .get function. It's not a lot. I'm not inheriting a lot of code here, right? Or make the decision of not using jQuery or Axios or whatever, and just use fetch that's built in, which is also done in React apps or in the wild, right? So yeah, it really depends is the answer, unfortunately, right? Any other questions? So just a quick review before we adjourn, to write it in the agenda file. AJAX, what is it again? Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. How much XML did we just encounter? 0, right? How much was it asynchronous JavaScript? Well, guess what? The browser and Node, it's all asynchronous JavaScript. So really, it's what? Asynchronous network requests, right? Made by the browser to fetch or submit data without refreshing the page. Examples of where it's used. Very common example that you can probably think of right off the bat that I've already used in mine is chat. Things like Messenger or Slack. The Slack app here, for those of you who don't know, this is actually built with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. I can't remember which stack they're using, if they're using React or Angular or Ember or Vue or something else. But they're probably using one of those frameworks because it's pretty heavy on the front end. So a lot of stuff happening, a lot of DOM manipulation. So jQuery itself would require too many lines of code and too much architecture decisions. Let's adopt a framework to help make some of those architecture decisions. But ultimately, when I submit here, I'm potentially making an AJAX request. Actually, what's happening is it's through WebSockets. But there is still some AJAX happening in this app as well.
I read VS Code and Atom are also
VS Code, the reason it's a bit slower than Sublime, a lot slower in terms of CPU intensity, is because it's actually running Chrome in the back, just like Slack, and it's actually a browser window, and it's HTML, CSS, and JavaScript as well. So a lot of desktop apps are actually now built with these technologies that you're learning this week / that you'll be learning later on. In fact, I've seen final projects that actually are native desktop apps. It's few. They use things like React Native or even just React and actually package it up in the same way using something called Electron. I could go on and on about this, so I'm going to be careful. But Electron helps you build desktop apps with, and it's what Atom, and I think, no, I think VS Code is not built with Electron, but there's different alternatives. But Atom, for example, is built with Electron, and I think Slack is as well. I'm not sure, don't quote me on it. But the idea is that it allows you to build things like Slack. And you can get desktop applications working using front-end JavaScript code. Oh, you can see who's using it actually. So Slack is using Electron. Pretty cool. Okay, I went over time and talked about stuff that I wasn't planning to talk about. Hopefully I didn't throw you off. You're supposed to kind of be focused on Twitter and get somewhat comfortable with AJAX and jQuery today. So good luck with that. And if you have any questions, their mentors are here. And good luck. Cheers.